Our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Well, last week, in the first round of the playoffs, there was a game where the Eagles were playing at home against the Packers. And during that game, an incident happened in the stands. And so what happened was this gentleman, an Eagles fan, was berating this woman who was a Packers fan and in Packers gear. And he said just these really, really horrific things. And I forget if it's her boyfriend or husband, pulled out, it's these days, he pulls out his camera and he videotapes this and, he records this and posts it online. And the internet did its job. They identified him. And of course, they then identified his employer. And he was fired by the middle of the week. The irony, by the way, is that he had yelled some incredibly sexist things at her, and it turned out he worked for a DEI consulting firm. Right? And so it was considered to be somewhat at odds with the culture of the company, and he was fired. Now, this set off a huge controversy online over the nature of Eagles fans. Because if you're aware of Philadelphia's reputation for fandom, just know, if you ever watched the movie Silver Linings Playbook, that kind of reminds you. And also know that Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia was the first stadium in the country that put a jail on site, right? Okay, for fans. So it unleashed this torrent of people, saying, well, that's just what Eagles fans are like. And Eagles fans saying, no, this is a minority. We're not mostly like that. There's just a few bad apples. At which point, one of the rejoinders was, well, why didn't anybody else step up? Why didn't any of the other Eagles fans, because this game is in Philadelphia, step in and say something to the guy? Now, we can think of a million reasons why you wouldn't, right? I mean, for example, do I want to risk getting into a fist fight with this person because he's clearly unhinged? If I'm an Eagles fan at this game, I probably am a season ticket holder and I paid a lot of money for these playoff tickets, and if I get into a fight in the stands and I get arrested, I'll probably lose my season ticket privileges, I'll get arrested. Right? There's a million reasons for why you wouldn't get involved. On the other hand, had someone stepped up and just said, hey, chill, it's a game, not only could they possibly have diffused the situation, he might still have his job. All right? So there were ramifications that possibly could have been avoided had someone else around there decided to step up. And this idea of when you have moral responsibility for a circumstance around you is sort of the theme of this passage as we deal with this first great miracle that is reported for Jesus in the Gospels, this wedding in Cana. Now, he's at this wedding with his mom, Mary, and the wedding is culturally a big thing. Now, this is centuries and centuries and centuries before you have the invention of the RSVP. Everyone is invited. Everyone comes. It's a big thing. okay? There are still cultures where this is the case. For instance, before our fire, because of the seating capacity of our a former worship space, there used to be, there's a congregation of Christians from India that's located in Teaneck, and they would rent our space for weddings because their church was plenty big enough for the number of people they would get on a Sunday, but for a wedding, everyone shows up and everyone's invited. So it would be like 3x, 4x the number of people that they would get on a normal Sunday, so they would need to rent a much larger facility for weddings. So the entire town may have shown up for this, and he runs out, the host runs out of wine. Mary notices this, says to Jesus, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me?" Now, every time I hear that opening, I'm just sitting there thinking, he addressed his mother as woman. I'm expecting the next verse to be, "And on the third day he rose from the dead." Okay, because that's what that's what it would have been in my house. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine addressing my mother that way. But what he voices is something you would understand. Why is this a big deal? It's just wine at a wedding. No one dies, all right? This isn't life or death. This isn't an injury. This isn't the most disastrous thing that can happen in a person's life. Sure, the host is embarrassed at running out of wine, but is this really an emergency? And how we choose to look at situations like that and the compassion that we choose to bring to a situation like that is something that was talked about by Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, it's Martin Luther King's birthday weekend, and there's a sermon that he preached in April of 1967 called "The Three Dimensions of a Complete Life." And one of the passages that he addressed in that sermon was the parable of the Good Samaritan that many of us are familiar with. And the opening of the story in the Good Samaritan is that two religious leaders, a priest and a Levite, see this person lifeless in the road, and instead of helping, they walk around him. Now, the reason why they did this is because it was a priest and a Levite. These are two persons who have a function in the temple, and they are on their way to the temple in Jerusalem. And under Jewish law, if you touch a corpse, you are ritually unclean for a number of days and have to undergo a ritual to be permitted to do the job. So if they had seen this lifeless person, they go up to him, and if they had tried to shake him and rouse him and say, "Hey, you okay, buddy?" and it turns out that he's dead, then they're ritually defiled and would be unable to do their jobs in the temple. So rather than risk being forbidden to do their jobs, they cut a wide berth around this person on the off chance that he happens to be dead. And the Good Samaritan is good because he chooses to stop and help. So this is what Dr. King said about that parable. He said, the first question that the Levite asked was, "If I stop to help this man, what will happen to me?" But the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. Not, "What will happen to me if I stop to help this man?" but "What will happen to this man if I do not stop to help him?" This was why that man was good and great. He was great because he was willing to take a risk for humanity. He was willing to ask, "What will happen to this man?" not, "What will happen to me?" All it took was the one person to sit there and look at the situation from the perspective of the victim, to look at the situation from a perspective other than their own. And this is something that we all need to learn, right? To learn to see situations from different perspectives. From the perspective of the guest, from the perspective of Jesus as a guest in this wedding, running out of wine is not his problem. Nor is it even a big problem. Nothing in the story said, by the way, the guests were upset, the guests were grumbling, the guests were insulting the host for running out of wine. That's not mentioned in the story, okay? So there's not even that as an aspect of the story. It's simply that culturally, the host is embarrassed, right? Which any of us would be, right? You can imagine throwing a party at your home. I think most of us would be mortified if we threw a party and we ran out of food, even though our guests would probably be very understanding, right? Your guests would be like, no, it's cool, we're having a good time, it's fine, it's not a big deal, right? Your guests would be understanding, your guests would be forgiving, but still, as the host, you'd be a little mortified that you ran out. And the question here becomes, do you care about that? Would that affect you? Would you worry about the host's embarrassment? All right, as opposed to saying it's not a problem and shouldn't be a problem for them. The ability to look at these situations from another perspective shows up a lot in our lives. Like there's a sign that I see at a lot of receptionist desks when I go places, and it's a sign that at first a lot of us relate to. I'm sure you've seen this posted. Failure to plan on your part does not constitute an emergency on my part. Okay? I think a lot of people read this sign, and we can relate to it, because a lot of times people have come up to us, and it felt like they were imposing on us. It felt like they were saying, you have to help me out of a jam of my own making. Okay? And it can feel like an imposition, it can feel off-putting, and so I think a lot of people can relate to this sign. But what was interesting is that, when I'm Googling for the right image of this sign, I saw a variation on it that made me go, ooh, I don't like this. And the variation went like this: your crisis is not my emergency. Like, ooh, okay, there's a big difference here. In fact, in my job, your crisis is my emergency, right? And for most of us with our friends, right, your crisis is my emergency, right? Your car breaking down is my emergency. Your health issue is my emergency. The fire in your home is my emergency. All these things, right? It's a crisis for you, and it's an emergency for me because it's a crisis for you. And when I saw the sign on the right, it actually made me rethink my willingness to accept the sign on the left. Because the sign on the left doesn't necessarily account for why the person failed to plan. Maybe the person intended to plan, but life happened. The person intended to plan, but their kid got sick. The person intended to plan, but something else cropped up. The person intended to plan, and their best friend's crisis became their emergency, and they weren't able to do what they had hoped to do in order to be prepared. So one of the things that I think these signs remind us is that the callousness of that left sign can lead to the callousness of the right sign, okay? Because once we stop caring, it can spread. Once we allow the callousness to drive our attitude in one part of our lives, we can be comfortable with it so it spreads to become callousness that infects other parts of our lives. And we have to guard against that. We have to guard against that because it can creep until it overcomes much of the goodness within us. Now, Mary has confidence that despite Jesus' initial response, that he's going to help. And so she tells the servants, do whatever he tells you. Now, Jesus didn't actually say, don't worry, Mom, I got this. Or even, don't worry, woman, I've got this. Okay? He didn't say anything. She just says, he'll take care of it. Just do whatever he tells you. And so he says, take those 6 water jars, fill them with water. He turns them into wine, So do the math, right? It's 120 to 180 gallons of wine, so now we've got a party. And it's such good wine that the steward is amazed, right? So the steward, who doesn't know where it came from, says, look, wow, this is amazing. Because everyone serves the good wine first and then the inferior wine after the guests are drunk. But you kept the good wine until now. It's not only good wine, it's better than it needs to be. He could have turned it into wine that simply matched the wine that had been served before. He could have turned it into lesser wine. But he turns it into amazing wine. I mean, these jars are not screw-top jars, okay? I mean, he turns it into fantastic wine. And in that same sermon, Dr. King addressed not just helping, but helping well. And he addressed it by writing this. He said, "What I'm saying to you this morning, my friends, even if it falls your lot to be a street sweeper, go on out and sweep streets like Michelangelo painted pictures. Sweep streets like Handel and Beethoven composed music. Sweep streets like Shakespeare wrote poetry. Sweep streets so well that all the host of heaven and earth will have to pause and say, 'Here lived a great street sweeper who swept his job well.'" If we're going to do something, do it well. If we're going to help someone, do it well. Because the excellence with which we do something in terms of our ability, our desire to not just do it, but do it well, reflects our attitude. Our attitude, our caring, is revealed not just in what we choose to do, but in whether we choose to do it well. Right? If you help a friend, help well. Right? Don't be like the kid doing chores who just wants to do enough to escape punishment, right? Do it well. The excellence with which you help demonstrates your caring, giving your all, caring. The excellence of the wine was a demonstration of how much Jesus cared. Because how would a person feel that you're helping if they could sense that you were doing it reluctantly or half-heartedly? Right? They would sense that you're doing it. They might wonder why. Are you doing it out of a sense of obligation? Are you doing it for your own ego? Whatever it is, who knows? But if your help is half-hearted, it will be sensed, and it will come across as a lack of caring. But when you care, it's because you're thinking about the other person. And so Dr. King wrote this about the overall attitude that these two things would bring, that attitude of looking at it from the perspective of the victim and choosing to do what we do well. He said, this is what God needs today. Men and women who will ask, what will happen to humanity if I don't help? What will happen to the civil rights movement if I don't participate? What will happen to my city if I don't vote? What will happen to the sick if I don't visit them? This is how God judges people in the final analysis. You know, we often forget sins of omission. We may pay it some lip service, but we often forget the import of it. We often ask, do I have to do it? Am I required to do it? But the answer to that question can really only be found by looking at the situation from the perspective of the other, looking at the situation from the perspective of the victim, looking at the perspective from the person who needs the help. Jesus didn't have to supply the wine. But when he saw the situation from the perspective of the honor of the host, he realized he needed to supply the wine. And if we start to think that our inaction is okay, then it can again spill over like callousness into affecting the way we think about anything we do. Because if we start to believe that our inaction doesn't matter, we can start to believe that our actions don't matter. See, if our actions matter, then our inaction matters. If our action matters, all right, inaction counts because it's the subtraction of the potential action. If we believe our inaction is okay, it will lead us to believe that our actions don't matter. And if we start to believe that our actions don't matter, then we actually don't believe in our own moral agency. Because if we believe that our actions don't matter, we're neither good nor bad. There's no moral agency, it doesn't matter. And so if we're going to believe that we have moral agency, if we're going to believe that we can act for good or not, then we also have to understand that our inaction matters. And we have an obligation to consider that as we think about what we're going to do. And what we choose will reveal so much about our character. It says at the end of this passage that Jesus did this, the first of his signs, and revealed his glory. And when he revealed his glory, it wasn't because of the power. Remember last week we had the story of Simon the sorcerer, a man who was able to do amazing deeds of power. Right? But that brought him no glory. The glory isn't revealed in his power to do things. It was how he used his power that revealed his glory. The glory isn't in making wine. The glory is in seeing a person's plight and fixing it. And it's a really important message to us that he fixed it in a situation that was not critical. Because it demonstrates to us, this first of his signs demonstrates to us that God cares about your everyday problems. God doesn't just care about the big things, the huge things. God cares about your everyday problems. So many people come to me sometimes, they talk about a problem that they're having, and then they minimize it. They talk to me about a problem, they go, well, and I know it's not a big thing in the overall scheme of things. And I know there are so many people in the world that are suffering more than I am. And I know that, this, that, or the other. You can fill in the blank on that, right? How many people you can fill in the blank on that? But the real answer is, but it bothers you. But you care. But it's creating stress and anxiety in your life. And don't fall for the comparison game, because the comparison game will get you every single time. Don't compare your blessings to someone else's. Don't compare what you have to someone else's. Don't compare your talents to someone else's. And don't compare your problems to someone else's. When it's bringing you stress and it's bringing you anxiety, God cares. And God's glory is revealed in Jesus caring about a problem that is less in an objective sense. But it was rough on the host in that moment and in that time. And so Jesus cared and demonstrated that God cares for us in our everyday problems. And we need to then turn around and show that same care to others, not just in the big things and the big issues of the world, but also in the small ones. Because how you use the power you have. And it may not be, probably isn't the power to change the direction of our society. It may not be the power to change big, huge cultural shifts in our world. But it may be the power to make someone's life a little better. It may be the power to solve a problem that someone else is having. It may not be a problem that is life-threatening. It may not be a problem That's the biggest problem around, but it's a problem they're facing. And if God can care about the problems we face, even the problems that aren't the biggest ones in the world, then we can use the power we have to bring a little joy to someone, to bring a little relief to someone, to solve a problem someone else is having, to just walk with them through a situation that they're facing. Because I think back to the questions that Dr. King asked, like, sure, what will happen to the civil rights movement if I don't participate? What will happen to the city if I don't vote? But remember one that he also asked, what will happen to the sick if I don't visit? And unless you're a physician, the answer doesn't have anything to do with their healing. It has to do with their loneliness. What will happen to the sick if you don't visit? It doesn't change the course of the disease, but it does change whether they feel they're alone in facing it. And that matters. And that's a power that each of us has to show others that we care, to resolve their plight when we can. And this story is a reminder for us to do these things with all the excellence that we can muster. Amen.